It took about 30 hours. That is the whole interval, the time it took the United States Army to announce that it had recovered a flying saucer, then to explain that it had recovered a weather balloon. On a Tuesday at midday in July of 1947, the press office at the airfield outside Roswell, New Mexico, gave the local paper 5 short paragraphs. By the following afternoon, the wire services were carrying the correction. One headline put it about as gently as a headline can. The flying disc, it said, had turned out to be just hot air. So, about 30 hours, start to finish. That is how long it takes to make something a joke. And it stayed a joke for 31 years. Nobody wrote a book. Nobody knocked on the rancher's door. The whole business simply left the world, the way a small, strange thing in a newspaper leaves the world, while the men who had handled it went on with their careers and their evenings and said almost nothing about it to anyone. Come in, friends. The lamp is low, and nothing in this room is classified. Set the day down, it has stopped requiring you. Tonight is Roswell, a few pounds of foil and sticks off a sheep pasture in New Mexico, plus the 80 years the United States has spent explaining them. You know the shape of this one already, the desert, the crash, the hangar, the silence. We will do it the way the country did. The stories first, exactly as America came to tell them, then the paperwork, piece by piece, as it came out. Some of it conceding more than anyone expected, some of it conceding nothing at all. Where the record keeps its counsel, I will say so, and you may land wherever you like. And there is a memo I am saving for later, written in secret 11 weeks after all this, by the general whose own command was supposed to be hiding the wreckage. What he wrote in it, believing that no one outside the room would ever read it, is the strangest document of the night. I will tell you now what this is not. It is not the episode where the government finally admits the saucer, because that admission does not exist. I am not going to hand you one that has not been written. What exists is stranger, and I think better. A suspicion that turned out to be right about the hiding and wrong about the thing hidden. And then a slow, badly typed 80-year argument in which the United States gradually conceded that the people it had laughed at were asking a fair question. If you drift before the documents open, good. They waited half a century. They will keep till morning. But first, the story as it is told. The field, the night, the hangar. The story goes like this, and it has been told the same way for 40 years. A storm over the New Mexico high desert on a summer night. The kind that stands on the horizon like a wall and throws light without much sound. Somewhere in that weather, so the telling has it, something comes apart in the air. Out on the range there is a long scar of wreckage across the grass, a couple of 100 yards of it, scattered the way a thing scatters when it strikes at a shallow angle and keeps going. And a mile or two on, in an arroyo, the rest of it. A shape lying tilted in the sand, its skin unbroken, too smooth for rivets, catching what light there is. In this telling, the debris itself is the tell. Foil that you could crush in your fist and then watch open again, flat and unwrinkled, with no memory of the hand. Beans light as balsa that would not burn and would not dent, though a man took a sledgehammer to one. And along a beam, so the story says, a line of small figures in a violet colour. Not letters anyone could read, not numbers, just shapes with the deliberate look of writing. Then the convoy. The story is very good on the convoy. Trucks out from the base in the dark, a cordon on the road, ranchers turned back at their own gates. Everything on that field lifted, crated and flown east under guard. First to Fort Worth, then onward to the great engineering laboratory at Wright Field in Ohio, where the country took apart whatever it did not understand. And in the tale, some of the crates are small, because the version America ended up with does not stop at wreckage. In the fullest telling, there were bodies brought in from the arroyo, and I will name that beat once and leave it exactly there, because it is the part every retelling reaches for, and there is nothing in it for a person trying to sleep. What the story wants from it is only this, that the base hospital was cleared, that a doorway was guarded, that men who came out of that building did not talk about it again for 30 years. And then the lid comes down. In the telling, the press release goes out by mistake, some officer moving faster than his orders, and within a day the army has produced a weather balloon, photographed a general holding a piece of it, then sent everybody home. The rancher who found the field is brought to town and kept there. And that, the story says, is the last honest sentence the United States said about Roswell for half a century. That, as the tellers have it, is the account the country came to hold, and I want to be fair to it before we open a single file, because it is not a stupid story. It is tight. It explains the wreckage, the speed, the silence, the retraction. It gives the whole thing a shape a person can carry. They found something. They knew what they had. They took it. They lied. Nothing about that is hard to follow, which is exactly why it travelled. But notice what the story requires, because this will matter all night. It requires that a great many ordinary people, clerks, drivers, a weather forecaster, a sheriff, 2 teenagers on a ranch, either saw nothing or said nothing for decades, without one of them writing it down. There is a second story, and it is really about those people. It is the story of the lid itself. The second story is the one people actually love, though it is not about a craft at all. It is about a lid. It goes like this. The rancher who found the field, a working man, a foreman, somebody's father, is driven into town and kept there for several days. When he finally speaks to a reporter, he says almost the opposite of what he said before, in careful, cooperative sentences, with an officer standing nearby. And then, as the story tells it, he goes home and does not discuss it again for the rest of his life. Not with neighbours, not with his own children, except once, briefly, to say that he had been told what would happen if he did. Then the paperwork. In this telling, the base's own records for those years are simply gone, not lost, not misfiled, gone, pulled out of the drawer, with no note explaining who took them or under what authority. And every man who might have said something is transferred or promoted or spoken to quietly in a corridor. What makes this version so satisfying is that its evidence is absence. Every hole in the record becomes a fingerprint. The missing files prove the removal. The rancher's silence proves the threat. The retraction proves the panic that required it. It is a story that gets stronger every time you fail to find something, which is a very unusual property for a story to have, worth naming out loud before we go a step further. Because tonight we are going to find a number of holes. I would like us both to have agreed in advance that a hole is not a shape. And underneath it all sits the feeling that gives this story its real engine, which is not fear. It is the suspicion that you are being managed. That somewhere above you there is a room where the actual sentence is spoken, while what reaches you is the version prepared for people who are not in the room. Anybody who has ever worked anywhere recognizes that feeling. It is why this particular tale outlived every other saucer story of its decade, and there were hundreds. So hold both of those tellings for a moment, the craft in the arroyo, the lid that came down on it, because they are what we are going to walk back through, slowly, in the order the country actually got the paper. And here is the honest thing to say before the first document, since we will be together for a while, and I would rather not surprise you with it later. No document released since concedes a craft. Not one page. What has come out concedes something else entirely. By the end, I think you may find it the more interesting concession that in that same desert, in that same summer, the United States really was hiding something it could not talk about, really did put out a story it knew to be incomplete, and had a reason for it that had nothing whatsoever to do with the sky. It begins with the town itself, which was a strange place to build anything, a farm town on a dry plain that had no business existing at all. According to the state's own guidebook, Roswell sits on a plain in eastern New Mexico, on the slope down toward the Pecos, about 3,600 feet up, in country that is mostly sky. By the record of its own founding, it should not really be a town. There is not enough rain out there to keep one. For the first 20 years of its life, it was a few buildings and a good deal of ambition. What made it was water, and the water arrived by accident. In 1891, on a place just outside town, somebody drilling for something else opened an artesian well, pressurized water that comes up on its own without a pump, out of a bed trapped under stone. The state guide records the discovery plainly, and then records what followed. Ditches cut through the plains, irrigation begun. That is the whole town in one sentence. Alfalfa, cotton, sheep, cattle, orchards, all of it standing on water that had been sitting under the dry grass the entire time, waiting for a drill bit. The same year, on a mesa a mile north of the center, they founded a military school. 47 acres of buff brick with towers, boys in grey uniforms marching on a parade ground in the middle of ranch country. So the two things that would define the place were both in the ground by 1891, irrigation and a taste for the military. Now the arithmetic that matters. In 1940, the census counted 13,482 people in Roswell. 10 years later, it counted 25,738. The census takers printed the increase themselves, 91%, near enough. The town roughly doubled in a decade. The decade in question is the one with the war in it, because of what came to live on the edge of that farm town. On the 6th of November 1945, 3 months after the war ended, the 509th Bombardment Group moved into Roswell Army Airfield and stayed for 6.5 years. That name may not mean much now. It meant everything then. The 509th was the unit assembled and trained to carry the atomic bomb, the one that flew the 2 missions of August 1945. In the spring of 1946, it was handed to the new Strategic Air Command as the nucleus of America's atomic striking force. Its first commander had been the pilot who flew the first of those missions. From January of 46, the group's commander was Colonel William Blanchard. Stand in that for a second, because it is the fact the whole night turns on. In the summer of 1947, the only military unit on this planet trained and equipped to deliver a nuclear weapon was living in a farm town in New Mexico, 4 miles from the alfalfa, next door to people whose grandparents had dug irrigation ditches by hand. Ranchers in town on a Saturday were sharing the sidewalk with the crews of the most secret capability the United States possessed, which produces the fact people find hardest to hold. Roswell, in 1947, was simultaneously the least likely place in America for anything to happen, plus the likeliest. It was the middle of nowhere, and it was the sharp end of the Cold War, and it was both of those things on the same street. That is the town. And that summer, the country above it had begun behaving very strangely indeed. 2 weeks before any of this, on the afternoon of the 24th of June, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over the mountains of Washington State, up in the northwest corner of the country, looking for a downed transport plane with a reward attached. He had 4,000 hours in the air. Somewhere near the mountain, he saw a line of objects moving between two peaks. Then, this being the part that gets forgotten, he timed them. He had a stopwatch on the panel and a landmark at each end. 9 objects, 50 miles, 1 minute and 42 seconds. That works out to about 1,700 miles an hour, a figure Arnold found so unreasonable that he shaved it down to 1,200 before he told anyone, which tells you something about the man. Then came the sentence that built the next 80 years. Asked what they looked like, Arnold reached for how they moved, like a saucer skipping across water. The newspapers took the noun and threw away the verb. By the end of the week, America was looking for saucers in the sky, which is not what he had said at all. The newspaper archives date the phrase entering print to the 29th of June, 1947. 5 days from a man's description of motion to a nation's word for a shape. And the country lit up, according to the count somebody finally made. A researcher named Ted Blocher later went through more than 140 newspapers from 90 cities and counted the summer of 1947 properly. 853 separate cases, over 3,000 witnesses across 49 states. Not a trickle, a wave, and one with a crest you can put a date on. The busiest day of the whole thing was the 7th of July, 162 sightings in 37 states from one coast to the other in 24 hours. The 7th of July, 1947, the day before the army at Roswell said anything at all. That is the piece the legend has no room for, and it changes the picture more than any document. On the day the rancher drove into town, the entire United States was already looking up and reporting things. Nobody at Roswell was announcing something into a quiet room. The tone of that summer is worth a moment, because it was not the tone people imagine. It was not terror. It was a kind of national squinting, half-serious, faintly delighted. Fighter planes sat armed on runways with cameras bolted in the noses. A vice admiral told reporters that the Navy owned exactly one tailless flying wing, and it was sitting at a plant back east. Vannevar Bush, who had run American wartime science, said none of it fitted any program he knew, and that he believed the whole business was illusions. Harold Urey, a chemist who had won the field's highest prize and had worked on the bomb, dismissed one popular explanation in 3 words. Transmutation of atomic energy, he said. Sounds like gibberish. And in Richmond, a government weatherman named Trotter told a reporter that he had watched one himself and knew exactly what it was. The pilot balloons his own office released twice a day, catching the sun. Then he added the line that could stand at the head of this entire episode, the way a motto stands at the head of a book. But when I tell them so, nobody believes me. That was the sky in July of 1947. Now the ground. On a sheep ranch 85 miles northwest of Roswell, a man had been sitting on something for 3 weeks. This is where the story stops being a story and becomes a man's own account, printed in his own town's paper, in his own words. Mac Brazel was the foreman of the Foster Ranch out past Corona in Lincoln County. On the 14th of June, he was riding fence with his 8-year-old son, Vernon, 7 or 8 miles from the ranch house. By his account, they came on a scatter of bright wreckage lying in the grass, rubber strips, tin foil, a tough sort of paper, sticks. Now hold the picture as he described it, because the ordinariness is the whole thing. A man on a horse, a boy on another, a field of grass with something silvery lying across 200 yards of it, a job to finish. He looked at it. He did not gather it. He was in a hurry to get his round made. Then he rode on and left it there. He left it lying there for 20 days. That interval is the single most inconvenient fact in the entire subject, belonging to the rancher himself. Whatever came down on that pasture, the man who found it looked at it, decided it could wait, and went back to his fences. On the 4th of July, he returned with his wife, with Vernon, with his 14-year-old. The paper calls her Betty. On a sworn statement decades later, she signed it Bessie. And they gathered the pieces up. All of it together weighed, in his estimate, maybe 5 pounds. He judged the whole object laid out would have covered about a tabletop. The balloon part, he thought, would have been perhaps 12 feet long. 5 pounds. That is a bag of flour. Then the kitchen. Back at the house, they spread it out on the floor and tried to put it back together, the way you would with anything strange. And here is the detail his daughter carried for the rest of her life. Tape along some of the sticks, 2 or 3 inches wide, printed with flower shapes in soft pastel colours. A neighbour who saw it remembered the printing as a sort of purple. The family got down on the boards and worked at it. The record says simply that they tried to make a kite out of it and could not do that. That is the scene. Not a cordon, not a convoy. A family on a kitchen floor at the beginning of July, failing to build a kite out of something they had carried in from a pasture. On Monday the 7th, he drove into Roswell to sell wool, where he mentioned it to the county sheriff, George Wilcox, who called the base. Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, drove out with a man in plain clothes. The two of them looked at the field and took what there was. That is 23 days from finding it to telling anybody. Brazel gave his account to the paper on the 9th, where the last thing he ever said publicly about it is the sentence that hangs over the rest of the night. He was sure, he said, that what he found was not any weather observation balloon, and then, wearily, that if he ever found anything again besides a bomb, they are going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it. He never did say anything about it again. And whatever you make of that, the same paper carried, on that same day, 5 paragraphs from the airfield that had already gone around the world. At midday on the 8th of July, the base intelligence office at Roswell announced that the field had come into possession of a flying saucer. 5 paragraphs. That is the entire document at the bottom of 80 years. It said the disc had been recovered from a ranch, that it had been examined at the field, that it had been flown onto higher headquarters. It named one officer by his initials, Major Marcel, the base intelligence officer. Nobody knows why that release went out. I want to be exact about this, because it is the emptiest space in the whole record, and everybody fills it with something. No document from that year explains the decision. No memo, no order, no note. The Air Force's own account, written nearly 50 years later, calls it an overreaction by 2 officers. But that is a guess made in the 1990s, about a Tuesday in 1947. It should be held as a guess. The honest sentence is that the United States Army announced the recovery of a flying saucer and left no record of why. Then the wire, as the newspapers of that week record it. One of the big news agencies moved 29 words that afternoon. 29. And those 29 words went everywhere at the speed of the telegraph system. The other agency, the Associated Press, put its Albuquerque man, Jason Kellehin, and its wire chief on the road for Roswell. A telephoto machine was trucked into the newspaper office so that pictures could be sent out of a town that had never needed to send any. In Dallas, a field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation typed up a teletype to headquarters that same day, and what it said, read it slowly, was that the thing resembled a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector. That teletype sat in a file for 48 years before anybody outside the Bureau read it. And on the same page of the same small-town paper, directly beside the flying saucer story, ran another item. A hardware dealer named Dan Wilmot and his wife had been sitting on their porch on a street near the middle of town, about 10 minutes before 10 one evening the week before, seeing something go over. Oval in shape like two inverted saucers, faced mouth to mouth. A quiet couple on a porch in the dark, in a town that had one of everything. It is the most human sentence in the file, and almost nobody has ever heard it. One more thing happened that day, and the legend has made a great deal of it. A routine order was issued at the base that day. Lieutenant Colonel Payne Jennings assumed command because the group's commander had gone on leave. The commander of the only atomic bomb group in the world left for vacation on the afternoon his press office announced a flying saucer, which sounds, put that way, like a man getting out of the building. Except that it was not. The paperwork authorizing that leave had been sent 2 days earlier, on the 6th, before there was anything in the world to leave. The teletype sits in the file with its own date printed on it. A commander went on vacation because his leave had already been approved. Sometimes a vacation is a vacation. By evening, the story was on every desk in America, and 160 miles east, in Fort Worth, a general was reaching for his telephone. The material was flown to Fort Worth Army Airfield, to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, then carried into the office of Brigadier General Roger Ramey. What happened in that office over the next hour is the hinge of the entire subject. We have it from the man who was called in a statement he swore to and signed in 1994. Irving Newton was a warrant officer, 7 years in, the only weather forecaster on duty at the base. His phone rang. It was the general's office. The message, as Newton remembered the wording, was that he should get himself over there immediately. If he did not have a car, he was to take the first one he found with a key in it. So a junior weather officer walked into a general's office where senior men were standing around debris spread out on the floor and brown paper. And this is his own account of the moment he understood what he was looking at. As soon as I saw it, I giggled. He asked whether that was the flying saucer. What he saw on the floor, he said, was a radar target, a Rawin, the reflector that hangs beneath a balloon so that a ground radar can follow it. It is built out of aluminized paper on balsa sticks, folded into triangles. Newton knew it on sight because tracking those things was his job. He had launched them. He had watched them go up in the morning and gone looking for them on a screen. Take the plane measurements, since they are the reason it looked like nothing on earth to a rancher and like a Tuesday to a forecaster. The legs of that target ran about 48 inches. The largest folded triangle was around 4 feet by not quite 3. Aluminized paper crumples in your fist and springs open flat again. The strange foil. Balsa sticks are absurdly light and quite tough, the beams that would not break. And the tape holding the sticks, in the version used that year, came from a manufacturer who had been printing it with flowers. Pastel flower shapes, on tape, on a secret from the sky. Raimi made 2 decisions that evening. He had photographs taken of himself and his chief of staff with the wreckage, and he cancelled the onward flight to Wright Field because there was no longer any reason to send a broken radar target to the country's most advanced engineering laboratory. Those 2 decisions together ended the story for 31 years. The next morning, the Associated Press carried the correction out of Fort Worth. What had been recovered was a harmless high-altitude weather balloon, not a grounded flying disc. Papers ran the obituary line the following day. The flying disc had turned out to be just hot air. So there are your 30 hours. And what I would like you to notice about them, because it is the thing the whole night has been quietly building toward. Nobody in that chain lied exactly. The rancher told the truth as he had it. The intelligence officer reported what he had. The press office announced what it had been told. The general's forecaster identified what was on the floor and said so plainly. Every single person behaved reasonably, and at the end of it, the country had been handed an explanation that was true and incomplete at the same time, plus a subject that would be laughable to mention for the next 3 decades. It was not incomplete by accident, but nobody in that office knew that, including the general. Now the thing nobody expects. Roswell disappears. It is said nowhere in Project Sign. It is not in Project Grudge. In 18 years of Project Blue Book, the Air Force's public study of unidentified sightings, 12,618 cases, Roswell is not referred to at all. No researcher wrote about it. No magazine ran it. For 31 years, the most famous incident in American folklore was, to the written record, an incident that had been explained on a Wednesday and closed. But the sky did not go away, and this is where I owe you the memo. 11 weeks after Fort Worth, the 23rd of September 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, commanding the Army's Air Materiel Command at Wright Field, its great engineering laboratory out in Ohio, sent a secret letter to Washington. That laboratory is the exact place the legend says the wreckage was flown to. Twining is the man who would have been sitting on it, and the letter was written for internal eyes, at a classification that meant no reporter, no rancher, and no citizen would ever see it. It was not one man's opinion either. The letter says so in its first paragraph. The finding came out of a conference of engineers and intelligence officers, the aircraft laboratory, the power plant and propeller people, the technical intelligence staff, a room full of men who spent their lives arguing about airframes. And what that room concluded, in secret, was this. The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Hold the word reported, because it does an enormous amount of work, and it is the word that gets dropped every time this sentence is quoted. Twining's committee is not saying there are craft. It is saying the reports are of something real, that pilots and police officers and weathermen across the country were not hallucinating and were not lying. In 1947, in secret, the Air Force's own engineers wrote down that the witnesses were credible. Say that again, because it is the hinge of the night. Not the objects, the reports. The people were telling the truth about seeing something. They went further. They described the thing from the reports. Metallic or light reflecting, usually no trail, circular or elliptical, flat on the bottom and domed on top, sometimes in tidy formations of 3 to 9, usually silent and moving above 300 knots. They noted the flight behavior, the climbs, the rolls, the maneuvers that had to be called evasive when American aircraft approached, and typed the word evasive with an underline, which is the only emphasis in the whole letter. And then they said, as engineers will, that America could probably build something like it if it wanted, and that doing so would be ruinously expensive. Now the second sentence from the same letter, the reason I saved this document all night. Among the considerations the committee lists as weighing against them is this one: the lack of physical evidence in the shape of crash-recovered exhibits. There it is. The general commanding the base where the wreckage supposedly went, writing in a classified letter to the Pentagon, listing as a problem the fact that nobody had any recovered crash material at all. If the United States had a craft in a hangar at Wright Field in September of 1947, then that is a sentence somebody forgot to stop. It was written in the secret document by the man in charge, in a paragraph nobody outside the room was ever meant to see. That letter created Project Sign. Sign became Grudge. Grudge became Blue Book, which ran until December of 1969. Its arithmetic is worth keeping. 12,618 sightings examined. 701 that it never explained. Not proven to be anything, just left open in a filing cabinet by the government's own study. And at the end came the Condon Report. 18 months, a university, $250,000 of Air Force money, whose verdict was that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. It went further in the part that lands. It suggested teachers should not give students credit for reading about it. That is what the official posture looked like by 1969. Studied, closed, filed, quietly discouraged in schools. Roswell, meanwhile, was not even in the cabinet. Then, in 1978, a retired intelligence officer answered his telephone. The man on the telephone was Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer named in the original 5 paragraphs, 31 years older and long retired. The caller was a physicist named Stanton Friedman, who had gone from working on nuclear aircraft propulsion to lecturing on flying saucers, and who had been given Marcel's name almost in passing. Marcel talked. He said the material had never been anything he could identify, that it was not a balloon, and, the line that travelled furthest, that he had been photographed at Fort Worth with wreckage that was not the wreckage he had brought in. A tabloid ran it. Then, in 1980, a book, The Roswell Incident, by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, which took Marcel's account, added interviews, and assembled the story most of the world now carries. By the record, 1980 is the true birthday of Roswell as we know it, not 1947. The story is 33 years younger than the event. And once it existed, it grew, which is the part worth understanding, because it did not grow the way a lie grows. It grew the way memory grows. In the first tellings there was strange debris. By the mid-80s there was a second crash site. By the late 80s there were bodies and a hospital and a nurse. By the 90s there were dozens of first-hand witnesses, where in 1980 there had been a handful, and researchers were counting hundreds of people connected to the case. The Air Force, reviewing all of it later, described the process in a line that is fair and rather sad. The account, it wrote, has since grown to mythical proportions. Mystical ones, too, the report added. Now let me be scrupulous here, because this is the place where an episode like this usually starts sneering, and I would rather not. The witness problem is genuine, and it cuts both ways. On one side, many of the most vivid accounts were given by elderly people, decades after the fact, sometimes prompted by researchers who already knew the story they were hoping to hear. And human memory is famously helpful in those conditions. It fills gaps with what makes sense, and it cannot tell you afterward which parts it filled. On the other side, in fairness, some of these were serious people with no reason to invent anything, who told the same account for years and gained nothing from it, and who were quite certain about what they had handled. The honest position is that testimony given 30 and 40 and 50 years after an event, about an event nobody wrote down at the time, cannot settle the question by itself, not for it and not against it. It is evidence about what people remember. What it is not is a record. And that is exactly why the documents mattered so much when they finally came. By 1990, the story had 100 voices and no paper. What it needed was somebody with the authority to open the filing cabinets. And in 1993, a congressman from New Mexico decided to do exactly that. But before the audit, the thing the audit found, because there really had been a secret in that desert in the summer of 1947, and it had a name. The secret was called Mogul, and the problem it was built to solve was the most frightening question in the world at that moment. How would the United States know when the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb? There were no satellites, nobody could fly over, so a physicist at Columbia proposed listening. A nuclear detonation puts a very low sound wave into the atmosphere. High above the weather, there is a layer that behaves like a channel, and a sound wave that gets into it will travel enormous distances, the way whale song carries for hundreds of miles in a deep layer of the ocean. Put a microphone up in that channel, hold it steady at altitude for days, and you might hear a bomb go off on the other side of the world. The declassified account describes Mogul plainly. Not one balloon, but a train of them. A string of neoprene weather balloons a couple of 100 feet long, carrying microphones, batteries, a radio, and, so the ground could keep track of it, radar reflectors. Aluminized paper, balsa sticks, and the tape from a novelty manufacturer with flowers printed on it. They were launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico in June of 1947. And the entire purpose of the project was classified. Not the balloons themselves, which anyone could watch go up, but what they were listening for. To say the word Mogul in 1947 was to say that America was afraid of a Soviet bomb and had built a way to hear it. A sentence not available to a press officer, a general, or a rancher. Now put a Mogul train on the Foster Ranch and look at the pieces on that kitchen floor. Rubber strips, the burst neoprene, a tough sort of paper, aluminized reflector paper, sticks, balsa, foil that opens flat again. That is what aluminized paper does. Tape with flower shapes on it. The tape. 5 pounds of it spread over a couple of 100 yards because a balloon train comes apart in the air and rains its pieces along a line. And the reason it looked like nothing on earth to the man who found it is that it was like nothing on earth in his experience. He knew weather balloons. There was a station that flew them. He did not know a 200-foot experimental array carrying microphones into the stratosphere to listen for the end of the world, because almost nobody did. There is the shape of the whole thing. The debris was strange because it was secret. The secret was real, The secret was not a saucer. Now the honest hole, because there is one and I will not hide it. The flight the Air Force identifies as the most likely candidate, the one it calls Flight 4, has no launch record. The project's own logs, which are otherwise decent, simply do not carry it. A field diary mentions a flight where the formal record does not. Skeptics of the explanation point at that gap and say, your best candidate is the one flight you cannot document. Defenders answer that early Mogul flights were often not logged when they failed, that the logs are patchy in exactly the way a rushed classified program's paperwork is patchy in its first month. Both of those are reasonable. The gap is real. It does not go away because the rest of the explanation fits well. I would rather leave it standing than smooth it. A hole in a launch log is a hole in a launch log, and you may weigh it as you like. What happened next is that the United States government was finally made to go and look, in its own files, under subpoena power, by people whose job was auditing. In 1993, a congressman named Stephen Schiff, who represented New Mexico, started asking the Defense Department what had happened at Roswell. He was not a believer. By his own account, he was annoyed. Constituents asked him, he asked the Pentagon sent him to the National Archives, and the National Archives sent him back. So he did the thing a congressman can do that nobody else can. He asked the General Accounting Office, the government's own auditors, to go and search. That audit is the most underrated document in this entire subject, because auditors have no theory. They have a list of places records live, and they go to each one. Along the way, the Secretary of the Air Force ordered her own review, releasing the men who had worked on Mogul from the secrecy they had been holding for 47 years. That is when the balloon train explanation came out, not from a leak, but because somebody in authority finally told a room of retired scientists that they were allowed to talk. This is what the auditors reported, and it is a strange mixture. They searched for aircraft accidents in New Mexico around that date. There were 4 in July of 1947, near Hobbs, Albuquerque, Carrizozo, and Alamogordo, and every one of them happened after the 8th. Nothing came down before the press release. They asked the Central Intelligence Agency to search its databases for Roswell, New Mexico. In May of 1995, the CIA reported back that a search of all its databases produced no documents at all. And then the finding that everyone remembers, because it looks exactly like the second story we told at the top of the night. The administrative records of Roswell Army Airfield from 1945 to 1949, together with the base's outgoing messages from 1946 to 1949, had been sent for disposal. And the form that authorizes such a clearing out does not name the authority under which it was done. Sit with how that sounds. The base at the center of it, its records for exactly those years, gone, with no signature. Now hold that beside the very next thing in the same report, because the two belong together and are almost never quoted together. The archivists explained that many Air Force organizational records from that whole period went the same way, without entering a citation for the governing disposition authority. That is, the box on the form went unfilled, routinely, across the service for years. It was not a Roswell practice, it was a filing practice, of the sort that survives in every large organization, where a clerk with a stack of forms and a records retention schedule does the tedious thing and does not fill in the reference. Both of those things are in the same report, and honesty requires holding them at the same time. The records really are gone, and the reason there is no authority on the form appears to be that nobody wrote authorities on those forms. Then, in 1997, came the second Air Force volume, taking on the bodies. Its answer was anthropomorphic dummies, the human-shaped test figures dropped from high-altitude balloons in New Mexico through the 1950s, in programs with names like High Dive and Excelsior. Some accounts of figures being recovered from the desert, it argued, were memories of those. It also named, plainly and once, 2 real accidents involving injured airmen, an aircraft accident in 1956 and a balloon mishap in 1959, as the likely origin of hospital stories. And the report was honest enough to state its own weakness in a single sentence, which I will give you because it is the fairest thing in it. Air Force activities occurring over a period of many years, it wrote, are now represented to have occurred in 2 or 3 days that July. That is a real explanation and a real problem, standing in the same paragraph. The dummies were dropped starting in 1950. The event is 1947. The report's own case is that decades of separate events have been compressed by memory into 1 week, which is very plausibly how memory works, though it is also, unavoidably, an explanation that arrives 3 years late. So, there is the audit, a search that found no craft, no CIA file, no accident before the 8th. A secret that turned out to be real and to be about Soviet bombs. A records destruction with no signature and an ordinary reason for it. And an explanation for the bodies that has a date problem it admits to. By 1997, the case was closed. Officially, formally, permanently, the Air Force clearly hoped. What nobody expected was what would happen 20 years later when the subject came back through an entirely different door. In December of 2017, a newspaper reported that the Pentagon had been running a program to study unidentified aerial objects, and the Pentagon did not deny it. The details, as the documents give them, are messier than the headline, and I will take them one at a time. First, there was money. About $22 million of it, arranged by a senator from Nevada named Harry Reid and tucked quietly into the defense budget, to pay for a study of advanced aerospace threats. Second, there was a study. It ran for a few years, looked at a great many things besides objects in the sky, and was shut down in 2012. Third, and this is the part the headlines flattened, the thing everyone came to call the Pentagon's secret program was, on the paperwork, never a formal Defense Department program at all. When the senator asked for it to be given the government's highest protective status, that request was turned down. So the story was not a secret saucer program was revealed. The story was that a government which had spent 50 years telling citizens the subject was closed had, in fact, been quietly paying people to look at it. And when the question was put to the Pentagon in public, the Pentagon confirmed the money. Then, by the public record, things moved quickly. And they moved in the direction of the record rather than the rumor. In August of 2020, the Deputy Secretary of Defense stood up a task force to track these sightings, Navy-led. In April of that year, the Department of Defense had already taken an unusual step. It authorized the public release of 3 gun camera videos taken by naval aviators, precisely because they were circulating anyway, and the department wanted the authentic versions out. In its own statement, it described what is in them as remaining unidentified. That is a government press office, on the record, using that word about its own footage. Then, in June of 2021, the Director of National Intelligence sent Congress a preliminary assessment. It is 9 pages long, and it is one of the strangest official documents I have read for this show, because of how carefully it declines to say anything. The numbers: 144 reports, from November 2004 to March 2021. 80 involved more than one kind of sensor, not just a pair of eyes, but radar and infrared together. And of the whole 144, the assessment identified exactly one with high confidence. It was a large deflating balloon. 1 out of 144. That is the sentence to keep when anyone tells you this document proved something. But then, in the same 9 pages, 18 incidents in which objects appeared to hold position against high winds, or move against the wind, or maneuver abruptly with no visible means of propulsion. 11 near misses reported by aircrew, and a set of 5 plain boxes into which the office proposed to sort everything. Clutter in the air, natural phenomena, our own developmental programs, foreign systems, and a 5th box labelled simply Other. And then the paragraph that ties this whole night together. The assessment explains why its own dataset is so thin. The reason it gives is not classification or sensors. It is that reputational risk may keep many observers silent. Pilots do not report, the intelligence community told Congress, because of what happens to a person who reports. That is the laugh from Fort Worth, still on the books, 74 years later, being cited by the Director of National Intelligence as a reason the United States has insufficient data about its own airspace. The office that took over from the task force in 2022 was given a name to be forgettable and a mandate that was not. Resolve anomalies in every domain. 2 years later, it published a historical review whose conclusion belongs firmly in the other column. No evidence that any government investigation had confirmed any sighting as extraterrestrial technology. Plus, no empirical evidence for the claim that the United States or its contractors had been reverse engineering anything. It went further, tracing several of the most repeated insider claims back to real, authentic, thoroughly terrestrial classified programs that people with partial access had genuinely misunderstood. One alleged fragment of a craft, tested, turned out to be a manufactured alloy of magnesium, zinc, and bismuth. So, the door was opened, and behind it was a stack of real questions and no saucer. And then, on a July morning in 2023, 3 men sat down at a table in a hearing room and were sworn in. The 26th of July, 2023. A House committee room. 3 witnesses sworn. Before a word of what they said, I want to put down the 3 columns we are going to keep separate, because this is the exact place where careful stories go wrong. There is what is established, hearings held, footage released, documents published. There is what is assertionsid under oath, which is a fact about the saying, not about the thing said. And there is what is unresolved, what nobody has shown either way. Blur those 3 and you will believe anything you like tonight. Keep them apart and the picture is genuinely interesting. 2 of the witnesses were pilots, and their testimony is in the first column and the second at once. Established that they said it, uncorroborated as to what it was. Ryan Graves flew off the Virginia coast and described objects his squadron encountered so routinely they stopped remarking on them. One came within 50 feet of an aircraft in a training area, 5 to 15 feet across, and shaped, he said, like a dark grey or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. A cube inside a sphere. His framing was the most reasonable sentence of the day. If these are foreign drones, he said, it is an urgent national security problem. If it is something else, it is an issue for science. Either way, somebody should be looking. David Fravor was the Navy commander who flew the 2004 encounter off California and described what he saw with the flat vocabulary of a man reading an instrument, No windows, no seams, no nothing. The third witness was different, and this is where the columns matter most. David Grush had served 14 years in intelligence, had been an Air Force major, and had held a senior civilian position where he was a co-lead for analysis of these phenomena. In 2022, he filed a whistleblower complaint through the proper legal channel. Under oath in that room, he stated that the United States possesses craft of non-human origin and has done for decades. Now read his own careful sentence about the basis for it, because he was scrupulous, and it is routinely dropped in the retelling. His testimony, he said, was based on information he had been given by other individuals. He was not saying he had seen a craft. He was saying that people he judged credible, with direct access, had told him things, and that his job had given him reason to believe them, and that he had reported it through the law's own channel for exactly this. That is a fact in the second column. A serving intelligence officer testified to this, under oath, before Congress. It is not a fact in the first. And the office that would hold such material had already reported, in public, that it found no empirical evidence of any such program. A flat contradiction between a sworn witness and a federal office that nobody has resolved to this day. The hearings kept coming. Another in November of 2024. Another in September of 2025, this one about whistleblower protection, where a former security officer told the room that what he had seen had changed how he thought about everything. And a Navy witness said something plainer and, to my ear, sadder. Sailors need to know that reporting these encounters will not harm their careers. And in October of 2025, the Federal Aviation Administration quietly changed a word in its own procedures. Controllers no longer log a UFO. They log an unidentified anomalous phenomenon. It is a bureaucratic edit of no importance whatsoever, and it is also the end of a very long argument about what a person is allowed to write down without being laughed at, which is the whole change, stated plainly. No agency has produced a piece of physical evidence. Nothing has been proven. What moved is who is permitted to ask, from a rancher who said he would never mention it again, to a hearing room where the question is asked into a microphone by people with subpoena power. The evidence did not change. The permission did. The town made its peace with it a long time ago. A museum opened on Main Street in 1992 in an old movie house, and it turned out that a great many people wanted to come. In November of 2023, it welcomed its 5 millionth visitor, and there is something perfect about who that turned out to be. A man from Roswell. 5 million people from everywhere on Earth, and number 5 million live down the road. Every July, by the town's own calendar, it holds a festival, and the streets fill with people in costume, and the shops sell what you would expect. I have no verified figures for what any of it is worth, so I will not invent any. What is plain enough is the shape of the thing. A farm town on a dry plain, built on water somebody found by accident, which was handed the strangest week of the century, and eventually decided to be gracious about it. So let the two endings stand side by side, at their honest, equal weight, and take whichever one you like into sleep. In the first, everything that was hidden has been found, and none of it was a craft. The secret in the desert was a string of balloons carrying microphones into the stratosphere to listen for a Soviet bomb. Neoprene, balsa, aluminized paper, and a toy factory's flowered tape. The strange debris was strange because it was classified, and it was classified because of what it was listening for. The general's own secret memo says there was no crash-recovered evidence. The FBI's teletype that same day said weather balloon with a radar reflector. The records went into a shredder with an unfilled box on a form, along with half the Air Force's paperwork from those years. 144 modern reports produced one identification, and it was a deflating balloon. And the office set up to find the hidden program went and looked and reported that there was nothing there. What declassification delivered was not vindication, but something rarer. A government slowly, unevenly, in bad prose, telling the truth about how little it knew. And in the second, in 1947, a man who said he saw something in the sky was a joke by Thursday. In 2021, the Director of National Intelligence told Congress that 18 incidents involved objects that held still against high winds or moved against them, with no visible means of propulsion, and that the file is thin because the people who see these things are afraid of being laughed at. That is the same laughter manufactured in a general's office in about 30 hours in July of 1947, still measurably costing the United States information 74 years later. In 2023, a man with 14 years in intelligence said what he said under oath, and the argument that followed was carried on not in tabloids, but in committee rooms and federal reports with footnotes. Nothing was proved, but the thing that changed is not the evidence. It is who is allowed to ask. The record holds both endings comfortably. It is in no hurry to decide, and neither are we. And the man on the horse, remember him once more, because the whole 80 years rest on a morning he was in a hurry. Mac Brazel found a field of foil and sticks on the 14th of June, looked at it, decided it could wait, and rode on to finish his fences. He came back for it 3 weeks later, spread it on his kitchen floor with his wife and his children, and could not make a kite out of it. Then he drove to town to sell wool, mentioned it to the sheriff, and spent the rest of his life wishing he had kept driving. Nothing in that field asked anything of him. Nothing in this one asks anything of you. The sky over that pasture is doing tonight exactly what it did that June, holding its weather, keeping its own counsel, and answering no questions at all. Sleep well, friend. Whatever is up there, it has waited 80 years. It will keep till morning. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here.